Is Canada ready, well, for basically anything? What Donald Trump has right about us, and why no one trusts the Americans anymore. This is On the Line. Hey guys, great to have you here. Here is another episode of On the Line. My guest today, Darrell Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Global Public Affairs, author of a new book, and we will talk about that later on in the podcast. It's called Breaking Point, and he wrote it with his usual writing partner, John Ibbotson. So we'll talk to him about that. But we're also going to talk a lot about a special survey Ipsos did of 20,000 people across dozens of countries for the Halifax International Security Forum, which, as regulars here will know, I attended last month. It's a fascinating snapshot of what people are thinking, feeling, and doing about we'll call changes in geopolitics. We're going to talk Canada, we're going to talk Europe, we're going to talk a lot about the United States, and then we're going to talk about his new book, which will touch on all of those things. Here is Darrell Bricker from Ipsos. Darrell Bricker, Global CEO for Ipsos Public Affairs, a guy I see around from time to time in Toronto and various other places. Darrell, you and I were both recently in Halifax for the International Security Forum, and every year there you present kind of, I don't know, you can describe it better than I can, but you guys do a huge survey of many countries all over the world, many thousands of people, and you focus on security issues here. So obviously over the next little while, you and I will talk about some of the specific findings, but can you tell me kind of a snapshot? What was Ipsos seeing this year? How are people all over the world feeling about security, safety, geopolitics, et cetera?
Well, we've been doing this survey, Matt. By the way, thanks for having me on. We've been doing this survey for the Halifax International Security Forum for, it's got to be at least a dozen years, and we're now up to interviewing people in 30 countries. So, 20,000 plus interviews that we do with people. And the thing that always is interesting to me is what people feel the threats are that they're facing and feel they'll be facing over the space of the next year, and how well prepared they think they are personally to deal with them, and also their governments are to help them deal with them. And we've seen a big transition over the space of the last dozen years where you go through things like, for example, if we had a bad forest fire season or there were bad floods in various parts of the world or whatever, the climate related things would be right at the top of the list. Or, if war was happening, people, if they were on close to where the war was happening, they were more worried about those traditional types of security threats. Will we be invaded? Will our sons and daughters be fighting in those places? Things like anything related to terrorism. If we'd see a spike in terrorism from year to year, if there were incidents happening in the news, people would be more worried about that. But what's really started to grow over the space of the last probably 5 or 6 years is a real focus on a war that people already think is occurring. They already feel they're combatants in it, and that's the war against disinformation and malicious use of technology, for example, cyber hacking. So people around the world, in almost every single country of the 30 that we interviewed, that feel that these are the top security threats that they're facing over the space of the next year. So it's a combination of, will somebody gain access to my banking information? Mm-hmm. Through to will somebody try to take control of my election campaign if I live in a democracy, or try to stir up civil unrest using social media and other things in order to do that. And the difference between other threats that they see is that in most of those other threats, they see themselves as kind of bystanders. It's something that will happen to your country, or maybe some people in your country, but maybe not necessarily you. These are threats that people feel in their day-to-day lives, and they actually feel at this moment, if this is the next conflict that we're already in it, that they're personally combatants in this process, and that it's taking place on the thing that we're talking over right now, or in their hands on their cell phones. And the most troubling part of this is not only are they most concerned about it, and not only are they really personally engaged in this, they feel it's the thing that their public agencies, their governments are least prepared to deal with. So to me, that was the most interesting finding in the overall survey was, we can talk about, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and yes, people are concerned about that. We can talk about China and talk about Taiwan, but every single day, so many times we feel like we're in the crosshairs for somebody who's trying to do something malevolent through technology that we initially started using for convenience and all sorts of other purposes, but now we feel it's a mechanism through which bad actors can access us, and they expect that our governments are going to be able to do something about it, and they feel that they are least prepared to do something about that.
When I was looking through your survey, all of it, and I mentioned you before we started recording, I probably only retained about a tenth of it, but one of the things that did jump out at me was exactly what you were talking about, which was people identifying what they thought the threats were, but also stating their degree of confidence in how the government could respond to that. And there were some really interesting ones, because you're talking about cyber threats and election interference, but you were also talking about things like conventional military attack, internal unrest, pandemics. Those were some of the other things you were polling on. And I was genuinely surprised to see how optimistic people were. And it wasn't like overwhelmingly like 98%. It was like 50-50 thought, 50% of the population thought we would handle a pandemic well. And I was thinking, does anyone remember the last one? It didn't go great. And yeah. I was struck by a fairly high degree of, I would suggest, perhaps unwarranted faith in public institutions to respond to these threats. But you're right. When you were polling on issues that have a more direct personal thing, like one of the other issues you were polling on was personal safety. If you or your family were to be subject to a violent attack, are you confident the system would look after you? It was really interesting to see Canada wasn't performing great, but no one really was. And I'll be honest with you. So like I'm a Toronto guy, and the last couple of years we've had a lot of crime in Toronto. The politicians and the cops right now are doing victory laps telling us crime is down compared to last year. It's still up a lot compared to recent years. And just dinner table conversation, Darrell, and I'm sure this is true of you as well. You can't have a dinner party without someone talking about getting mugged or getting shoved on the TTC, or they got their car stolen. That didn't used to be the way it was in this city, at least. People are worried about things at a very primal level that, in my experience, and I'm not that young anymore, this isn't what Canadians used to be like.
Yeah, in fact, we did a big survey for the Toronto Star. They do an annual report card of how people feel about living in the city of Toronto, since you mentioned Toronto specifically. And yeah, they are very concerned about this. And they do feel it's something that's deteriorating. In fact, they're really concerned about the general deterioration of the city of Toronto. The interesting thing is, as far as the mayor is concerned, really tenuous as to whether or not people will re-elect her, not because they don't personally like her. They actually think that Olivia Chow is a reasonably well-intended, nice person. But the results that the government has achieved are the things that will potentially drag her down, and are certainly dragging the reputation of the city of Toronto's council down. And yeah, these are the kinds of things that are difficult. And this is it's always funny to me, and I see this in the United States when people claim in certain instances, and why it fuels the fire of what Donald Trump is doing when it comes to doing things like sending the National Guard into various cities. If you're the person who stands up and says, look, you ignorant people out there, you don't understand how great you've got it, and here's my chart, and let me show you. That is not what people want to hear these days, because they do go to those dinner parties and they do hear the things that are happening around them. And after a while, things move from isolated incident, as you were suggesting, into, okay, what are the facts about what's really happening? And I want to point out what I thought was a fantastic piece of reporting you personally did on this, Matt, which was the one on guns in the city of Toronto. And we're at the sources of guns in crime. And it turns out, guess what? It's not sports enthusiasts who are having their guns stolen, and that's what's causing crime. These are smuggled guns that are coming over a porous border that are causing untold devastation in the city of Toronto. And the only person who is prepared to talk about it was you. And you actually did the research. And this is one of the things I find in my own work, is that it's really important to just kind of shove away your prejudices and perceptions of what's good and bad and whatever, and just get down to the facts. And on these types of issues, sometimes the problem that we've got is that what the public is perceiving is so contrary based on their day-to-day experience with what official facts are about what's going on, that they really have to ask questions. And it's become even more so since we came out of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
The questioning of authority, the questioning of science in ways that we would never do it before. It's sowed the seeds for a place for this type of conversation to take place. Unfortunately, the conversation is usually taken over by bad actors with really malevolent political intentions. And I'm not labeling specifically who it is, but actually what the debate really needs is what you did, which is to say, let me go look at the actual statistics from gun crime. And I'm sorry, all of you people who are advocates and who have political agendas that are afraid of what these findings might be. And, I'm not ever going to go take a look at it because I really don't want to know the answer. And we don't want to have a fact-based position because it's all based on our hearts and our good feelings and everything else. All of a sudden they have to confront the reality. And that's when change really starts to happen, is when people start confronting the reality. So good on you for doing that.
Reality is terrifying, but occasionally it must be confronted.
Yeah.
You were talking a minute ago about public health and things like that, and bad actors who manipulate that. And I think that loops us right back to what you guys were polling for Halifax. I know that I am worried about things like cyber threats, online disinformation, really hyper-realistic deep fake copies of people's physical likenesses or voices, which can be used for personal fraud. It could also be used for geopolitical trickery and propaganda. I know I'm really worried about that. I also suspect I'm not worried enough. And I keep having moments, and this happened to me a few times when you and I were both at the forum in Halifax, where I was listening to some of the presentations and also some of the off-the-record sessions. I don't know if the broader public understands how dystopian this could get. And there's that phrase people throw around, and I've used it, you've probably used it. Oh, we live in like a post-truth society. My gut feeling, Darrell, is that we ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah, and that's what the public's feeling too. And that's part of what the problem with the way the pandemic kind of worked its way through was that, public health people became political communicators rather than scientists. Some of them, by the way, enjoying themselves way too much doing this and not being the sober second thought that people were expecting would be happening. And in order to generate the right type of public behavior, we're really torquing a whole bunch. I mean, if you go back to some of the models that were done, I'll just use the, province of Ontario, about what was going to happen. Nothing was even close to what ended up happening. And what ended up really occurring was that this disease infected generally and was very destructive, but was especially destructive for a very specific group of the population. And by making it everybody's problem and by not having any sense of proportionality in anything that was going on, we ended up missing the thing that needed the most support, which was people living in long-term care situations and people who were, compromised. Their immunity was compromised by crushing people going to school or going to the playground or going and doing whatever. And, I have to be sympathetic. I mean, this was a crisis in which people were trying to get the right outcome. But the long tail of this is that. The one that you just pointed to, which is what can I believe now? What is the truth? Who can I believe now? And that's something that we're still trying to work out in an environment in which people feel like they're fighting with this every day. And that's what I really saw in the Halifax Security Forum survey was that it hit me. It was people don't talk about the next war. They're already fighting the war now, as far as they're concerned.
A friend of mine, and this is kind of like I said, people don't know how dystopian this can get. A friend of mine about a year ago, as a joke, asked an AI to read a bunch of my columns and generate a new column in my tone, and then sent it to me and said, "Hey, Matt, I was just reading this piece you wrote. Man, it still holds up." And I read it, and I didn't think it was me, but I wasn't sure. And like, I was reading this, I was like, I don't think I wrote this. I think this is, I remember thinking at the time, I think they're trying to trick me with an AI. It's trying to copy my voice and they're trying to prank me. But I was only about 70% sure. It was possible that I had written that and had forgotten this, because I write a lot of columns. And particularly when there's a lot of news events happening, you write a bunch, you don't remember all of them. Like, I've written things that I'll never think about again and probably would disagree with now. That's the life of the columnist. But I wasn't sure. And you've heard of stories, they're in the news, of people getting phone calls and it's their wife's voice going, the car broke down, I'm at the shop, you need to wire the guy some money because my visa is not working. Please send an e-transfer. He's going to put a new belt in the car and I'll be home in 20 minutes. And the dutiful husband goes, okay, and sends an e-transfer for $800 for car repairs to some account that just disappears. And the wife gets home an hour later and he goes, hey, how's the car? And it was an AI. It was spoofing her voice. You and I are public figures enough, Darrell, that there's more than enough of our voice on the internet that people could make a pretty accurate duplicate of it.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's fraudsters and pranksters. When we start talking about what nation states would be capable of here, like if an actual enemy of the West, North Korea, China, Iran, Russia, certainly, actually decided to put serious money and computational power into creating video clips and voice messages and hit us in a coordinated swarm of disinformation, I don't think we could defend ourselves from that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's true. And you know, keep in mind, and I do have to remind audiences sometimes, you know, and people I'm speaking to, that ChatGPT has been around for like 3 years. I mean, and and it's just the most publicly available one. It's maybe not even the best one. I mean, so who knows what, you know, the state actors who have access to billions of dollars and all the engineering talent that you could find in their system, what they can come up with. But, you know, I'm going to take it one step further. You know, the European Union, European Commission just sued Twitter. And it's like these major technology companies are almost becoming non-state actors.
Yeah, I agree.
In a really significant way. And you know, and now Elon Musk is fighting back, you know, who knows what that actually means. And you sit back and say, you know, this is a very, very interesting plasticine type world in which it's just being shaped. And AI is just one part of it. I mean, watching what's going on in the United States right now with how they're going to engage with the world, but also watching in China and watching in Russia and watching the European Union, and, you know, looking at the issue of immigration and looking at the issue of, you know, the middle class success and, you know, what that's going to look like. Looking at the collapsing, and this is something I write about a lot, collapsing fertility around the world and rapid population aging. We're going through a tremendous amount of transition, and we're just kind of, there's so much of it going on. It's difficult to kind of put it together and take it in a specific direction. But the thing about this, all of this, Matt, is it's all compounding. It's not like just you have these separate streams and they're going to go in a certain direction. These things are all hitting against each other and causing things that maybe, you know, one particular thing couldn't have steered in a particular direction. When it's caught up with another particular thing, it goes in that direction. And when you say, you know, we're not sure about where all of this is going to go, based on the conversations that you were having in Halifax, that's exactly correct. I feel exactly the same way. And it's the beauty of what the Halifax Security Forum puts on, because people like you and I get exposed to what's happening. I mean, for example, everything on drone warfare that's happening in Ukraine and Russia right now, people say, oh, you know, that's warfare has been transformed incredibly, which it has been. But these aren't exactly technological dynamos.
I know.
That are working on this. What happens when people who really have these kinds of capabilities and they introduce them into the battle space? What's going to transpire? And one of the things that I found, you know, especially fascinating in Halifax was the discussion, and it's a really pertinent discussion in Canada right now, which is military procurement and preparing. You know, what is our 5% of spending going to go to and what that's going to look like? And listening to the Ukrainians talk, because the Russians aren't there, it would be interesting to get their perspective, but the Ukrainians talking about the speed of of innovation and transformation on the battlefield. Like, it's not years, it's hours, it's days. And, it takes us how many years to commission whatever it is from a supplier and to go through our procurement system. And they have this type of private-public partnership system that combines the best of, I would say, articulation of public need with the speed of what the private sector can achieve to come up with these types of solutions to counter what the Russians are doing. And they're just staying on top of it. And it sounded so different than what happens in most procurement for the military. So even there, we're going to see transformation.
I haven't written this yet, so I'm giving you a bit of a spoiler. You and the audience get a bit of a spoiler of a column that's going to be coming out soon. I'm going to have to be a little vague, Darrell, and I'm going to tell you why, and I'll mention this in the column. My family recently went through a kind of bureaucratic hell getting a minor variance permit for
I've done that. Yeah.
Something that needed to be renovated. Not even a new structure, it was a renovation, but the building code had changed from the time when it was built to when it needed to be renovated. And the only reason I'm being vague is because minor variances are public and I don't want anyone looking at my address. So I'll be a little bit vague about this, but it took exactly 36 months to get the permit issued. And I'm in Halifax dealing with the tail end of this bureaucracy to get our basic, effectively what came down to a new roof. that's and the time between the building had been constructed. I know. Your new book. Yeah, I was going to ask.
No, I'm just going to say we write about this. I mean, you want to know why we have a housing crisis in this country?
Because it takes 36 months to get a permit to fix a roof.
Yeah.
And I'm talking with Ukrainians in Halifax, and they're telling me that basically their drone factories will operate on a new model of drone, combat drone, and they'll make them for about a month. And then all those drones will get used up. And then the next month, they're making a slightly improved version of that drone because they're assimilating from the battlefield. They're assimilating reports from operators and troops, and they're monitoring effectiveness. This works really well. This could use some improvement. And the next month's run of drones incorporate that. And at the end of that month, they iterate it again. And we're a country where a renovation permit requires 36 months, while the Ukrainians are iterating and deploying new weapon systems every 30 days. And the Ukrainians told me they're actually hoping to get that down to 2 weeks.
Yeah.
They think 4 weeks is not quite fast enough because the Russians are adapting as well. And now it's an innovation race. And like I said to you before, like, I know I should be worried. I'm not convinced any of us are worried enough. We are in a country that works on decadal timescales. And think about, this is a little off topic. I don't mean to drag you all the way to domestic politics, but the Major Projects Office has a stated goal of getting approval timelines down to 2 years. 2 years would be almost a miracle by Canadian standards. And if the Ukrainians move that quickly, they'd be Russian by now.
Yeah, well, we don't even have to go back that far. I was watching a documentary the other day about the Spitfire. The iconic, most beautiful looking fighter plane, although it was constructed for deadly purposes in the Second World War. There were 15 marks of the Spitfire. So there was a new Spitfire every 4 months. A different version of the Spitfire every 4 months that was adopting to everything from what was the requirement in terms of the space that they were fighting in, through to what the innovations, like the Focke-Wulf 190 when it came on in the Second World War in the 1942, 1943, that was so much better than the previous marks of the Spitfire. Yeah. The British, in that old technological world, with no computers, no computer-assisted design, no artificial intelligence or anything, came up very quickly with another mark of the Spitfire that met the battlefield advantages of the Focke-Wulf and ended up defeating it. So, we've done this before. The problem isn't the technology. The problem isn't the capabilities. The problem is the people doing it. Yeah. And the bureaucracy. And what we've set up in this country is an entire system of no.
Yeah,
it's an entire system of no. I characterize the federal bureaucracy, which has grown by 40% in this country over the space of the last 10 years or whatever it is, as a giant editing machine. All they do is one person writes something for another person to edit, for another person to edit, for another person to edit. How much of this is actually needed? I mean, in the private sector, you would never do it because you would go broke. And I'm not saying business people should run government. I mean, they're obviously involved
different
in
beasts, yeah.
different things, but the process of doing things needs to accelerate to the level of the modern world. And we're just not there. And you don't have to accept an opinion. Just look around you. Just look around you at the facts. And that's the thing about, the beautiful thing about the private sector. Beautiful is probably too strong a word, because, Schumpeter called it creative destruction too of capitalism, is that the market tells you if it's a stupid idea, the market tells you to stop spending on it because you go broke. If you're doing it inefficiently and somebody else is doing it better, you'll be out of business if you don't adjust and adapt. Now, there are things that only the public sector can do in terms of the appropriate level of regulation. But if it's not related to the health and safety of people, why is the government involved in this at all?
I think Darrell, like you said a minute ago, that the government is a no machine. That's the effect of it. But what I actually think happens in all the in-between phases is actually no one gives you any answer at all. And it's a punting machine, right?
No. It's the same as no.
The effect of it is no, because nothing gets done, right? But what we found when we were just trying to get the friggin' permit was that no one said no to us. What they would say is, well, we need another report. Or, yeah, you know what, we think we're going to approve this, but you got to go out, you got to do this thing first. We need another assessment done. And then after the assessment's done, we're going to refer that back for review by the original guys. And they come back and they go, yeah, this looks good, but I think we'd probably better coordinate with these people. And what I think happens is, as long as you never actually make a decision, you're not accountable for anything. And these people don't want to be accountable. It's like this entire machine for passing the buck until eventually it gets to the point where someone has to finally do something. And then you probably get what was the obvious answer at the very beginning, which was, hey, can we fix our roof? They were never going to say no to that. But we had to spend 3 years going through the process first.
There's a whole industry that lives on saying
100%.
No. So the pettifoggery that you were going through in all of this, it's like the giant editing machine that I was talking about. It makes no sense. It's like the movie Brazil. Right? I mean, it exists to exist for itself.
Yep.
And that's why, you need, and I find it amazing with the federal government in Canada that they're now building all of these offices on top of the bureaucracy that has already grown by 40%. So if things got done by the bureaucracy that's grown by 40%, why would you need these other offices like the major project office? Yeah. Shouldn't those people already be in? And if you don't need those other people, why don't you get rid of them? I mean,
addition by subtraction.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've lost track of what the ends are here. And ultimately what the public cares about are the ends. Who cares about the means or the extremists? They're the ones who care about, and they're the ones who use the means to plug up everything else.
When we talk about these domestic issues, there is a collision with some of the stuff at Halifax, because one of the things you were looking at in your survey, and I did look at all the national numbers, but I looked particularly at the Canadian numbers. There is a very high willingness in the Canadian population to spend more money on defense. Mm-hmm. There's also an even higher recognition that Canada needs to have a powerful military. One of the things I laughed at looking at your numbers was like something in the 80% range of Canadians agree that we should have a powerful military. And it's in the 60s that agree that we should be spending more money on the military. So I'd really like to talk to that 20% in the middle and just whack them over the head with a shoe a few times. But in general, in terms of how Canadians are feeling, where are we landing on defense, and how has that changed over, say, the last year or so?
It's changed a lot. And having a strong defense that's all people, who would say no to that? I mean, we need to have a weak defense. I mean, so they want to have strong defense, and they also feel that they need to spend more on it. That's the thing that's changed. So what's happening is actually that number is aligning more with the desire. What's really changed, though, is actually not those two questions so much. It's the level of priority. So when you go out and you ask people what are the most important issues facing the country today, the ones we need to most focus on, you see defense has moved way up that list in comparison to where it's been. Now, it's not up there with cost of living, and it's not up there with taxes, and it's not up there with housing, access to housing, and it's not up there with unemployment and those kinds of things. But it's certainly in that mid-tier of things that government is expected to deal with. And usually what would happen is when you traded defense spending off, because every budget-making exercise is an exercise in trade-offs, when you would trade it off against all those other things that people cared about, it would usually end up on the bottom of the list. So my expectation is that it's going to be more resilient as we go through this next piece. Now, that's not because Canadians feel the world is dangerous as much as they now are starting to believe that the United States is not the friend that it once was. I think a very similar phenomena that's happening in Europe right now, where also governments are expanding their defense spending because they feel that the system that they were part of is no longer possible for that to defend us in the way that we need to be defended. Now, exactly what the threats are, probably different than the ones that DND has identified, which is where it's going to get really interesting. But yes, they're feeling they're in an insecure world, that the security system that we were able to basically free ride on over since the end of the Second World War, that's no longer reliable, and that we're going to have to take some responsibility ourselves. And, you know, to give Donald Trump, and this is going to be very hard, and I don't want you to choke when I say this, Matt, give him some credit. So when Ibbotson and I were working on the book that I held up before, my going in proposition to this was really a book that I read previously, and you did too, when you were in school, called Lament for a Nation by George Gurney. And there's a lot of crazy stuff in that book. But he did ask one really important question, which is, are Canadians a unique species on the North American continent? And that's basically what Donald Trump challenged. Mm-hmm. He challenged that question. By the way, the same way the United States challenged Canada back in the 1860s. The same way. They were raising the same question. You are not a unique species in the North American continent. You're actually part of us. And that's what Donald Trump was saying. And he made a couple of observations. One of them was, you're so reliant on us for your prosperity. I mean, I don't know, 80% of our trade is with the United States. It's declined a little bit recently, but is with the United States. So how can you be an independent country if you're so reliant on us? And the other question you raised, and it's pertinent to this conversation, is you can't defend yourself. How can a country that can't defend itself claim that it's a country? Why don't you join us? You'll have the best defense that you've ever had. You'll be part of the Golden Dome, as he's been talking about. And it's like, that's not wrong. It's not wrong in the sense that those are reasonable observations. And so Canadians are starting to wake up to the idea, I think, that, it's not going to continue as it once did. One of the things that we're going to have to start taking more responsibility for is our own defense. And and the relationship with the United States is potentially a frenemy type relationship. And then we have to take certain responsibilities for what we're doing. So that's why I think you're seeing those numbers move a bit closer together. And I think that the defense spending will be a bit more resilient than we've seen in previous budget cycles that we've gone through.
Something, Darrell, that I've written is that a problem for Canadians, and I know Canadians pretty well. I love you. I love you all. I am you. But we have some blind spots and we have some weaknesses as a country. And I think Trump is wrong about a lot of things. I think he's right about a few things. Yeah. And I think he is right about Canadians being defense freeloaders. And he is right that we have let our sovereign state capacities atrophy because we have become completely dependent on the United States to either do certain things for us or to enable us to do them. And he is completely right about that. And I think it's going to be very hard for some Canadians, I'm thinking of certain demographics in particular, to do that mental exercise of going, I disagree with him about all this stuff, but he's got a point here. And I'm worried that Canadians are going to throw out some of the introspection we should be doing, some of the stuff we ought to be taking a long, hard look at ourselves in the mirror on, because, Orange Man bad, and he said a bad thing about a Hollywood star, or he tweeted something rude about a Democrat, and therefore we should ignore 100% of what he has to say. No, I think we should listen to everything he has to say, and I think we should ask ourselves what is true and what is not. And some of what he is saying about us is true.
We've kicked a lot of cans down the road for a very long time, and to beautifully mix the metaphor, the chickens have come home to roost.
Yeah,
and that's on defense. That's definitely the case. You can't be a country unless you can defend your sovereignty. And the sad part of this is there was a time when we did, and we could. Which means that there's a possibility that we could do it again. And it's not like you have to worry so much about the Americans invading you, but it's that you have to be a competent enough country to defend your own and protect your own interests, that the Americans don't feel the need to do it for you. And the thing that I fear in this is not, the Russians and Chinese in the North. I mean, our military likes to deal with that. It's kind of like, I remember, back in the late 1980s, government couldn't deal with the problem of unemployment, and so it created the problem of the deficit. This was the thing that they were going to focus on rather than unemployment, because it was a problem that they felt that they could solve. I think that the North, and then unemployment, of course, the deficit ended up chasing them around in the woods like Frankenstein. They created their own monster. But that's the problem that we've got in the North right now. I think that our military thinkers, our foreign policy thinkers think, it's the thing that Canadians will support. And we've got to go take care of that. And if we just take care of that, everything will be fine, except that they're not. Except that they're not. And so at some point, when you start harping on about the North, and as the polar ice cap starts to melt away, and that becomes a trade route, and we know the Chinese are building icebreakers, we know the Russians are extending their space up there. The fact that we've got 4 submarines and only one of them occasionally working, we've got these new AOPs that can't go into the high Arctic, they can only go there seasonally or whatever. At some point, if there's a threat up there, the potential is that the Americans will go up and solve it for us, even if it violates our sovereignty. That's the biggest problem, I think, that we're not able to protect our borders. Yep. It's not defending against invasion from the south or whatever. It's creating a situation in which the Americans become so underwhelmed by what we're able to do for ourselves. A threat happens and they have to do it. And then what are you?
A sovereign country is a country that has the ability to enforce its rule over its own territory.
Right.
And that's a pretty basic summary, and we can quibble with it and we can dance around the edges of it if we want. But on a fundamental level, you are master of your own house or you are not. Canada right now is not. Or if we are, it's only because people have been polite enough not to force the issue. Remember, this is a few years ago, but there was a G20 or something happening in Australia. I think Harper was still prime minister. And it kind of out of nowhere, a small task force of Russian ships showed up off the Australian coast. And the Australians were able to send out a couple of destroyers or frigates or something to move into formation with the Russians and keep an eye on them. And I remember talking with Canadian officials who just said to me, if we were hosting this thing in Vancouver and a couple of Russian cruisers showed up off Victoria, we might send out like a patrol ship or something. But our ability to actually generate force within or adjacent to our own territory was effectively nil. And it's worse now.
Well, we've got Canadian Rangers up there, right, with the guns that are cracking and all sorts of other things. And great, I mean, they do great service with minimal capacity. But I mean, sending up F-18s to intercept Soviet Bears planes from the big, propeller-driven planes. That's how old they are. Yeah. And saying, we're protecting against a threat. No, the threat is hypersonic missiles. Mm-hmm. And if your listeners ever go look at what a hypersonic missile can do. It's not a ballistic missile that goes up in the air and comes back down and you can predict where it lands. Hypersonic missiles are like super fast cruise missiles that they can redirect and they can attack you go around the world and attack from the others. They can do these amazing things. We have nothing that will defend against that. And that is a real sovereignty threat. So when Trump's talking about the Golden Dome, That's why, because the Russians have this stuff. And by the way, the Americans are slow on this as well. But,
I know.
These are the things. And I mean, what protected Canadian sovereignty in the past was the British fleet. I mean, the reason that the Americans didn't, simply march over the border after the American Civil War was they were afraid of the British. They weren't afraid of us. And well, what's our connection to the empire now? Particularly, and this is not a small thing. The death of the Queen is going to have some influence on this as well.
100%. That was a sentimental bond, and I think Charles has done an okay job, but
okay is not good enough.
He doesn't have 70 years of accumulated affection. No. Talking about accumulated affection, one of the things that jumped out at me in your survey was that you poll countries and how they feel about other countries. How do we feel about the Europeans? How do the Europeans feel about us? I saw that you were polling a lot of Latin American countries, which I was really glad to see because there's not a lot of attention paid to Central and South America. So good on you guys. I found that interesting. There was one country whose public opinion or opinions of was in absolute free fall, and it was the United States. And there was one country where that was more pronounced than anywhere else. It was Canada. The entire world.
1 and 2 is Sweden, depending on the question that you asked.
What do you make of that? And I know that's an open-ended question, but I ask it deliberately. Like, I want you to actually take the floor here. What do you think about what's happened to American public esteem in the world?
It's entirely predictable. And, the past is prologue. Exactly the same thing happened in 2016. The United States bled off like 15 points. I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but it's in the mid-teens. Bled off that amount, and it bounced back to the level that it was prior to Trump when Joe Biden got elected. And it started to decline at the end of it, Biden's term. I mean, Afghanistan didn't help him, and a few other things didn't help him. But still stayed kind of in the range of where you would typically see the United States, which is, kind of mid in the table. And then Trump gets elected, and it's right back down to where it was. But the crash in Canada is harder this time. And they've dropped more this time. So yeah, reputationally, absolutely. I call it, the Trump dump, and that's exactly what happened.
At Halifax, I was talking with some former U.S. government officials. Not a lot of current ones showed up this time, and that's going to be something I write about in my first column from Halifax, which will be out shortly. And if writing goes well today, it may in fact be out before this podcast goes out, but we'll see if the writing spirits move me. Not a ton of Americans there. And a lot of the Americans who were there were representing companies or NGOs or think tanks, but not government officials. Government officials were usually former government officials. One of the things I found fascinating, and I had a couple of chances off the record to speak with former U.S. government officials about this, I think there's a sense among some of them that Trump is a phase, he's a blip, he's an anomaly, and he'll end, and then America will just step right back into its kind of late 20th century global leadership role. I don't think that's true. And I think we're talking about the accumulated goodwill the Queen had. I'm not saying America's gone. It's not. America's still big and powerful and rich. And the American people generally are very friendly and are great ambassadors of their own country. But I think in terms of the allies trusting America to step back into that leadership role, I don't want to say it's over, but it ain't going to be what it was. What did you take away, both from the polls, but also the conversations you had at the forum in Halifax?
Yeah, I found this was one of the more fascinating forums, because the United States, other than the congressional delegation, the Trump government didn't allow any of their military people to come over. And they're doing this at conferences all over the world. And there was a lot of, particularly from the plenary stage, a lot of speculation about what Americans thought or America would do or whatever. And it's that lack of certainty. But you almost feel like, that we're in this place of suspended animation where people are just waiting for this thing to kind of go back to normal. It's like it's like Canadians today thinking the same thing, because that's what everybody else is thinking. This guy, the big orange man, is gone, and then all of a sudden things are going to go back to whatever. And it's like, okay, well, I might as well just pull my blankets over my head and go back to sleep and, wake up and things are going to be back to where they are. And I think I concur with what you're suggesting, which is, no, I don't think so. Because not only is the trust really undermined, but the capabilities are also disappearing. So, the United States closed USAID, it's gone. And it's not going to be easy to stand those kinds of things back up. I mean, the capabilities themselves, they're basically walking away from, whether they're shutting down bases or they're moving personnel and capabilities from and we saw their foreign policy statement, the president's foreign policy statement at the end of last week. I was reading it on the weekend. I mean, it's a huge pivot from Europe over to the Pacific, and they're going to be moving capacity, and we've seen this even with Latin America with what they're doing in with Venezuela. I mean, they've got a carrier task force over there. I mean, they're going to be moving these capabilities, and you can't just press a button and make all that stuff happen in the other direction. He spent a year pressing a button as hard as anybody can, and it is moving, but just to go back into that space is going to be difficult. But the other thing, Matt, is there's a real fundamental questioning of this role of the United States in the actual performance of the United States and what it achieved from what it was doing. So I think the aid area is one of the interesting ones, where people say, on the right, and they ask some interesting questions. One of them is, the assumption is, oh, there's all these people who are going to die as a result of doing this, and definitely there is. But if we're not paying for it, will somebody else pay for it? They're not really sure. The idea of soft power. I mean, this was a big thing back in the 1990s. And the assumption now is, well, if we're not doing it, is China going to do it? And because that's usually the charge that's put on the table. And it's like, well, China has no record of doing that. They don't have humanitarian agencies. They're not running around and doing this stuff. And so, is there a threat to their soft power as a result of pulling out of this? And what did soft power exactly get them? I mean, the only way they can stop most of the things that the UN votes on is by blocking it on the Security Council. So, the questions that get asked by the American right, they're not exactly wrong in some instances, because what it does is it questions some of these very fundamental things that people didn't ask questions about before. And as a result of this all happening in a pretty short period of time, and this going to continue to go through the space of this next 3 years, simply just pressing a button and reversing things, particularly when you've moved all of the facilities, gotten rid of the things that you don't want, and effectively created an argument on the other side, which really questions what the dominant philosophy was. I don't know how you turn it back so easily. It's going to be tough.
We've only got a couple minutes left, but I do want to give you, because you're not just a smart dude and a buddy of mine, you're also an author. You have a new book you are talking about with. You held it up. Hold it up again. Tell us about the new book.
New book. It's called Breaking Point. Written with John Ibbotson. It's about the new big shifts affecting Canada, putting Canada at risk, and really everything that we were talking about today is what the book is about.
Yeah,
it's about Canadians, this is the world. How are we going to exist? And the biggest thing in this is, and we didn't get a chance to talk about it because it's not, we were talking about Halifax, but all of this is happening in a context in which the fractures that are facing our country internally are the most precarious they've been in a long time. There's horizontal fractures, and we're seeing it in the West in terms of our national unity question. The perennial one is possibly going to come back in the province of Quebec, where they're going to have an election in October, and we could be facing, for the first time, a national unity crisis on both the prairies and in Quebec. At the same time, we've got a whole group of people in this country, our younger people, who feel that the Canadian promise is no longer paying off for them. And, we asked a question a year ago around this time, might have been 2 years ago. No, it was maybe a year ago, because it was just before Donald Trump came into office, when this talk started about Canada becoming the 51st state, we asked a question which was, and this is at Ipsos, if they offered you full American citizenship and all of your assets would be converted to US dollars, would you consider voting to join the United States? And in the mid-40s of people under the age of 35 said yes.
Yeah.
There's your problem. The Canadian promise is not paying off for this group of people the way it paid off for their parents. So the elbows up crowd, yeah, Canada's great for them, but for their kids and their grandkids, it's not working so well. So we've got a lot of issues that we need to deal with. So John and I identify what we think are the most important ones, those big shifts that are affecting Canada, and then not just leave it there, but we actually suggest some pretty major changes to the country in the last chapter called the Big Fix. A lot of them relating to governance. So, for example, getting rid of the Senate. And I know everybody's, up in arms. You can't get rid of the Senate. It's in the Constitution. Constitutions are, they're meant to be amended. I mean, and we need to figure out a way of doing this because there needs to be a way to deal with these regional and provincial tensions that exist in this country other than through what it was originally intended to be, through the Senate. And by the way, if I hear one more person say the place of sober second thought, that was the House of Lords, not the Senate. The Senate was a place where the regions got together to talk about these issues, very similar to what happens in the United States. So things like that. And also the one that is my favorite is decentralizing the federal government. So in other words, every single department that crosses over into provincial jurisdiction needs to move out of Ottawa.
Yeah.
Put culture and heritage, put that in Saskatoon.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we'll get a different perspective on what being Canadian is.
Put energy in Calgary.
Put energy in Calgary. Put fisheries in Halifax. Put parks in Banff.
Yeah.
Put people with the people that are actually using whatever it is that they're doing. And for parks, put them in the place that they're trying to protect so they understand what they're dealing with, rather than writing another cab doc that's going to be edited by 47 people as they try to keep themselves busy and justify their job in Ottawa. This country has to change, or, guys like Trump will change it for us.
Darrell Bricker, thanks for a great conversation. I'll see you soon, but in the meantime, really appreciate your perspective. Thanks for this.
Thanks a lot, Matt.
That was Darrell Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Global Public Affairs. Wonderful to have you here. Check us out, as always, at readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe, and we hope you enjoyed this latest episode of On the Line.